So suppose I run a little thought experiment with you guys here today. I say, I'll give you $50 now, or I'll give you $100 in 6 months, all right? So in behavioral economics, most people actually pick the quick cash, all right? They pick $50 now rather than the $100 down the road, okay? So I'll give you another scenario. Say we fast forward the situation 3 months ahead. In 3 months, I'll give you $50, but in 9 months, I give you the $100. So ironically, in this situation, most people are willing to delay that gratification and actually wait for the larger payout. So this kind of research in behavioral economics actually has been replicated many times, where people actually make certain kinds of discounts to the utility of certain things. So whether it be cash or whether it be exercise or dieting as well. So the irony is that both situations were effectively the same. Okay, just time shifted about 3 months apart. The other way to put it is that the present self, okay, if you fast forward it down the road, it's going to regret the decision that it makes 3 months down the road. So in essence, and this is the general conclusion from most behavioral science and behavioral economics research, is that in general, people are irrational, all right? So in that situation, we knew of the utility of money, all right? We know of its worth. So my job today is to try and put together that sense of utility to sleep. It's essentially what a lot of us do with our athletes as well, to give that sense of importance of utility to our athletes, so that hopefully by the end of us supporting the athletes, they equate the utility of sleep as much as they do with money, all right? So my job today for the first part is to increase the sense of utility for sleep. So my name is Haresh. I'm from the National Youth Sports Institute. And so I'm going to be breaking my talk into 3 different parts today. So the first part, a little bit more about sleep, its importance. The second part, a little bit about the behavioral aspect, leading on from Shauna's talk as well. And in the last bit, just some points for discussion. I think like Shauna mentioned, it's still a very emerging area within Singapore, within sports as well. And I'm going to also try to highlight certain contextual things that it's very unique to Singaporeans, all right? So a good time to reflect. We're all, as adults, meant to get about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. So just think about how much you got last night. I put this up there because I wanted to highlight that actually, depending on the stage of your life, you actually need different amounts of sleep. Just like in the animal kingdom, different animals require different amounts of sleep. So sleep quantity differs according to age, differs according to the kind of activities that you actually do. So beyond just the quantity, how we sleep is actually very different. So this image here is of a bottlenose dolphin, and so bottlenose dolphins have a very unique manner of sleeping. This is Toby. Toby is asleep now. He actually presents with unihemispheric sleep, meaning that he actually falls literally half asleep. Half of his brain actually goes to sleep while the other half actually stays awake. So it's an evolutionary mechanism to ensure the safety from predatory animals like sharks. So whales also display this behavior. So you can actually see like this part. So this part of the brain, contralateral side, is actually asleep. So which is why you see no movement on that side of the dolphin. So just to highlight that how we sleep is really very different as well. So we know from an abundance of research that sleep has got a multitude of cognitive enhancement properties. More and more, we're also starting to realize that it actually has got a lot of relevance in terms of general health implications. So just by going on a restricted caloric intake diet, that alone would allow you to lose a certain amount of body fat. But what researchers are finding is that if you actually extended your sleep slightly by about an hour, all right, you're actually able to lose more fat and actually put on more lean muscle mass, okay, if you control for everything else, all right? So just getting that additional amount of sleep allows you to actually have better body composition. Just a couple of days, I just pulled this out this morning, quite a large data set. They've actually found that now sleep actually has got pretty strong associations with a person's dehydration. And what they suspect and hypothesize is the hormone vasopressin, which actually regulates your hydration during the day. It actually gets released a lot more towards the end of a sleep cycle during deep sleep. And if you're truncating your sleep, that kind of gets taken out of the equation, probably resulting in higher rates of dehydration. This is still very early research, and I think it's quite prevalent for our, or relevant for our population. So a whole host of other health-related research is highlighting that with insufficient sleep, not only are there minute health outcomes, all-cause mortality is currently linked with insufficient sleep as well. So the key question, and I think it's a big one, if I don't get enough sleep, am I not less productive, right? Because then I don't get to do my work, you know, my bosses are going to be chasing me, I'm going to be having to answer emails, all right, so what then? So luckily, we've got some guys who are doing research on work productivity, and what they find is that there is a point of diminishing returns, whereby if you actually work beyond 60 hours a week, and you're actually replacing sleep with work, you're going to be making more mistakes, you're probably going to be sick more, the likelihood of accidents are going to be increased, and it therefore reduces the productivity that you actually have at the workplace. So the RAND Corporation actually ran a study, and what they found was that in the US, those sort of related associations, negative associations because of workplace improductivity actually lead to a fiscal cost. It's about $411 billion per year due to fatigue-related incidents. All right. So to put that into context, Singapore's education budget is about $12 billion a year. So imagine the cost savings if this was actually addressed. Once again, in the US, leading cause of death in teens are actually car accidents. So when anti-lock braking system actually came to be, it was actually called you know, a modern marvel, all right, because it actually reduced accident rates by about 20 to 25%. So then what they found was in high schools in a state in the US, what they actually tried to do was they actually delayed school times, all right, by about an hour, 20 minutes. And what they found was that just delaying school time, all right, allowed for the students to get significantly more sleep and actually reduce accident rates by 70%. So if you weigh that against ABS technology, it's here we have, you know, essentially a free behavior, okay, which ironically we're not really capitalizing upon. So in terms of the neuroscience type research and increasing the utility, this is a good example I tried to tell our coaches and athletes as well. So scientists actually embedded EEG in the brains of certain rats, and they actually tried to listen to the neurons firing as this rat was actually learning the pathway through a maze, all right? So hopefully this works. See if you can actually hear the neurons firing. So that was when the rat was running through the maze, all right, and what they started to do after that was to monitor the brain of the rat as it went to sleep. So what you heard originally, that was when it was learning at real time. When it was sleeping, it continued to replay in the brain during deep sleep 20 times over and over again. Okay, so this was actually fairly early research highlighting that the learning from the rat maze actually continued while the rat was actually sleeping. So transpose that into actual human learning. All right, we now know that a simple task like a simple motor learning task, actually the learning gets amplified during a sleep bout. So say I ask you to memorize a certain set motor pattern, just like imagine you're playing a piano, and I ask you to try and tap on that pattern and remember it as much as possible. So if you're awake, okay, your brain tends to chunk these numbers into smaller component parts. Okay, and what the research actually is finding is that when you go to bed, the brain actually consolidates that motor pattern, all right, allowing you to actually perform that task better with sleep than without sleep. So if you, as a coach, think about that in terms of coaching an athlete a certain skill, a motor pattern, the consequences of not getting enough sleep is effectively them actually losing on potential learning and actual training experience. We know from Rayner and Horn as well that with insufficient sleep, your ability as a tennis player to serve a ball into a set target space actually gets reduced. And what they went on further to do was actually try and see if caffeine actually would improve performance. And what they found was that there was nothing that would compare to sufficient sleep. And we're not talking about extreme sleep deprivation. These guys were getting about 7 hours of sleep a night, and for the restricted sleep condition, they were asked to get about 5.5 hours of sleep, all right? So highlighting again the fundamental need for sleep, and in some cases ergogenic aids actually really do not actually improve performance. In high school students, youth athletes, there is a strong association with the amount of sleep that an athlete gets during high school and the likelihood to actually get injured. So the thing about, as Shauna pointed out as well, sleep-related research has been in sport. It's actually really on an uptrend at this moment. We've been trying to scrape data that we try to get to actually try and see associations with performance as well. Mainly because sleep-related research is actually quite expensive and it's quite inconvenient on the part of the athletes as well. So big data sets, quite hard to find. One type of data that actually has been used in sleep analysis is actually daylight savings research. So during daylight savings, effectively what happens, your time clock shifts and people tend to lose about an hour of sleep right after daylight savings. And in Europe, what they actually found was that in the days after daylight savings onset, when a person has actually lost about an hour of sleep, in the population, there is about 25% increase onset of a myocardial infarction, okay, or a heart attack immediately after daylight savings. When daylight savings actually gets removed and things go back to normal, it reduces by about 21%. Okay, so on this vein of research, we recently tried to web scrape some data from the Bundesliga, and we pulled out about 8 seasons worth of data, trying to see if we could see any associations with the onset of daylight savings to any kind of performance measures. And what we found was that in the week after daylight savings, it's about 37% increase in injury rates reported in the Bundesliga alone. So if you're interested, go out there, look at the data sets that are available from NBA, Major League Baseball. let's see. Okay, let's compare and see whether this sort of phenomenon actually is in other sports as well. So hopefully at this point, I've done an okay job increasing the utility of sleep. So we know, okay, sleep's important. So if I asked you at this point, okay guys, let's assume that all of you are not getting sufficient sleep at this point. Would you increase the amount of sleep that you actually get tonight? Or would you, like many people, say, you know, okay, actually, yes, I know the utility of sleep is pretty high, but the utility of Netflix, my goodness, you know, how do I discount for that, all right? So that's the problem, I think, at the crux of it. We have all these other things, okay, emails, gaming, homework, social media, that in terms of utility, it's actually, sleep's actually not up there with those other things that people actually do. And effectively, what we're trying to do is actually move people into what's known as the habit zone, where the perceived utility is very high, and they're able to do it very frequently. And that's the struggle, right? And as Shauna mentioned, and I myself, we don't have all the answers because it's really quite individualized to the context as well. So more about context, okay? So here is where we're getting a bit of a local flavor. Using smartphone data, very, very big data set, Singapore currently stands to actually have the least amount of sleep, okay? And we also are the people around the world that actually sleep the latest and wake up the earliest as well. So internationally, we are winning this race, okay? So a large part of sleep is governed by the sunlight and you know, the sunrise and sunset rhythms. And the issue is, does our standard time, so Singapore is +8 GMT, does it coincide with actual solar time? So a Google mathematician actually put this map together. So the parts of the map that are actually white, sorry, let me go back one, where it's white indicates parts of the world that solar time actually matches standard time, okay? Red means that it's ahead, blue means it's slightly behind. So we're here, okay, Singapore is actually +8, so is Malaysia, where we're actually, based on solar time, closer to about +6 hours 55 minutes. So already based on sunrise, sunset, we're actually a little bit off. And you can actually see that in the weather patterns or the sun set patterns, where sun sets in Singapore and Malaysia a lot later than places in the world like Hong Kong and Taiwan, where it's actually meant to be +8 GMT. Okay, so why, Haresh, are you talking about this at this point? The issue is because sun sets later in Singapore, the release of melatonin also gets delayed, right? So that means that Singaporeans tend to get primed for sleep later at night, but you still have to wake up at the same time for work and school as your +8 GMT counterparts. So in general, our experience is that our quantity and quality of sleep actually gets fairly affected. So why don't we just solve this by just trying to sleep earlier, right? Just, you know, make it a habit of sleeping earlier. So I work with youth athletes, and this is very tough. So remember Toby and how his sleep patterns were slightly different? Adolescent athletes also have very, very different sleep patterns. The adolescent brain goes through a process called synaptic pruning right around puberty. What occurs around that is a slower accumulation for sleep need, meaning that they want to fall asleep later in the day. Their circadian rhythms effectively become completely misaligned to the adult sleep rhythm. The melatonin onset in adolescents are also delayed, all biologically driven. And lastly, as Shauna has mentioned as well, we're living in a very, very tech-heavy environment. And the blue light from these devices actually, the receptors, the photoreceptors in adolescents actually perceive these lights greater than you and I would. So effectively, if you and I stared at the screen for about an hour, okay, our sleep would get delayed by a certain amount, but with adolescents, that gets amplified, all right? The melatonin gets shoved way back, all right? So this is why a lot of our guys here, the youth, tend to sleep at about 1 in the morning, 1:30 in the morning, all right? Completely misaligned sleep patterns to the adult population. So it's almost as if the adults are living in a certain time zone, okay? The adolescent is living in another time zone, but we're making them wake up based on this time zone, all right, our time zone. And it's showing, all right, in quite a fair bit of data that's being done by Duke NUS. And more recently, so Rico and I have been doing this study looking at the prevalence of and sleep habits of youth athletes in Singapore. 7 out of 10 are not getting the sufficient 8 hours of sleep a night. Keep in mind, this is self-reported data, so they tend to overestimate how much sleep they're actually really getting. So the likelihood of more of them actually not getting sufficient sleep is pretty high. So then how do we shape these habits? Okay, so by understanding that we're irrational beings, can we retrain ourselves to make better decisions? Can we essentially be more predictive in our irrationality? And so this is a work in progress, all right? So if we try to increase the utility of sleep, a perceived utility by knowledge or by providing a really, really good sleep environment where sleep basically is so delicious that they want to go to bed. A lot of the time in Singapore, because it's warm, it's very, very difficult to actually get a good night's rest. Sleep is not very appealing. The other thing that we try to get athletes and coaches to adopt the philosophy of sleep being part of training, and asking them, would you actually skimp on training hours? Would you actually skip training? And if you wouldn't, then why would you actually skip sleep? Okay, because effectively you're losing out on potential learning from the sleep. Also reducing distraction utility. So what do I mean by that? So early on I talked about things like Netflix and email. There are apps out there that basically can, it basically blocks the port numbers for Netflix, for example, at a certain time of night, all right? So you're basically removing the ability for a person to go on Facebook, go on Instagram, go on Netflix, and you're actually making it a lot more difficult for them to actually, display and actually use devices or distraction devices that actually take away time for sleep. Or you could actually put a commitment device. This one's quite interesting. So basically you commit to a certain behavior, but you actually give them your credit card details. So if you don't actually achieve what you've committed to in 6 months, for example, it'll donate a certain sum of money to a charity that you don't like, all right? The circadian realignment bit, because as we mentioned, adolescents have a different circadian rhythm, and geographically we're actually a bit off as well. It's really about optimizing the schedule. So we live in a world where, essentially the adults are in the center and the youth actually revolve around our sleep patterns. But should it be the other way around? All right, where we actually adapt to their sleep patterns if we really want to optimize their learning and their health and their capabilities. So my take is only if these three become available, do they really get a long-term sense that sleep really is very regenerative. It actually improves performance, thereby resulting in adherence to a longer-term, non-negotiable sleep routine. How do we do this? I think it's really depending on the context and the background that we come from. Yep, and that's me for today. Thanks.